about that later on. So I have the comments open here, and I will try to answer everyone's comments. It seems there's a lot coming in, so give me some time to answer everybody's comments and so on. I see someone asked if it's being recorded. Of course, it's on YouTube Live, so it will be later there to play back and watch again. So don't worry if you miss out on that. So yeah, let's minimize this, of course, because you're seeing that. I've basically got something here open on my screen. This is kind of a course on, like, let's say, an A to Z PDF where basically I talk about how to take pictures of the night sky. So that would be the basics, of course, right? Because you can't go out or you can't get to your computer and edit your images if you haven't taken them. So I'm going to take you through the process of, what equipment you need, how to take those pictures. And as I said, any questions, please drop them down in the comments. I will try to answer those. So let's jump down through this. We have a table of contents here talking about basics, planning, single image, exposure and aperture, ISO, and then a few more experienced or more advanced techniques and so on. We won't be talking about all of them because we don't have time today. But my goal today is to get, for those of you that are new to this, to give you the chance to learn some of the basics you need so you can go out there and start taking pictures, right, of the night sky. So here we are with basics. One of the key basics is always to shoot in RAW format. I think everybody knows that. If you don't know that, basically JPEGs are not going to hold all the data and information in the images, so you won't be able to edit them as good as you can a RAW image. So that RAW image contains all the data within the image, and that allows you to manipulate and play with the image in post-processing and Lightroom and Photoshop and so on. So big important thing to make sure you're shooting in RAW. So I love to use full frame and mirrorless cameras. And optimal results, most of the images that you've seen of mine, if you've seen them online and so on or on social media, most have been taken with the Sony a7 IV. Cameras even like the a7 III or maybe the newer a7 V, they're all great cameras, but for me, a7 IV is one camera that always stays in my bag. It's a fair priced camera, and it literally does it all. And I can't, talk more higher of it. For me, it's my favorite camera out there, to be honest. Now, when it comes to using a lens, and especially if you're a beginner, I always suggest going out with a lens like a 14mm, something wide. So a lot of people like to play around with more narrow focal lengths, 24, 35 and so on. And I know that beginners like to push and go into that as well. But actually most of my images that you see are all taken with extremely wide lenses. So for example, the Sony 12 to 24mm or the Sony 14mm f1.8. Now these lenses, f1.8 or f2.8s, are very fast aperture. So, the more aperture, the lower the number, f number, the more light that comes in. So you can gather more light and get more information in your pictures. And that's really important for night photography. So I see in the comments someone asked if I have an astronomy specified camera. So my cameras are astro modified. I've modified them so that I can see the red H-alpha nebulas and so on. It's not mandatory to do that. You can still get great images without modifying your camera. But obviously if you want to take it a step further, then that's something you can do. If that's something you're interested in, you can always DM me later and I can explain a bit more about that or where you can get that done. Now I have one rule here. It's normally more mandatory on workshops or tours that I do, or when you go out with others. Obviously be respectful of others. Don't shine your headlamps or torches in other people's directions. Also vice versa, you don't want people doing that to you. When you go out and you're trying to take pictures of the night sky, you want as little lights intervening your photos. And that goes without saying. Obviously you want to get away from the city and go into unpopulated areas where there are darker skies. And if you don't know how to do that, then you can always check out the light pollution map, which if you just search in Google, you'll find that. And there's a dedicated light pollution map that shows you the areas where it's darker and so on. But we'll talk a little more about that later on. Now, key to getting sharp images is obviously dependent on the stability of your tripod. So if your tripod and camera are firm and sturdy on the ground, and they're not shaking and not movement, and there's no movement and so on, then you're going to get those sharp images. But obviously if there's some wobble going on, even if you're really hard pushing the camera and so on, that's why some people like to use an intervalometer, a remote control, or an app on your phone to press the shutter, and that avoids any camera shake, and then you get sharper images. So that's a bonus. And the last basic is obviously going out at night time. You might go out and it's cold, or you might go out in certain areas. So, be well prepared in terms of wildlife or clothing and so on, or let people know where you are and so on for safety. So we're going to move forward to actually talk so we'll jump to settings afterwards, because key number one is obviously planning, right? So you might know your settings, and you might have your equipment ready, but you want to go out and take a picture. You cannot just go and take a picture. You cannot just step outside your house. Some people, have the luxury of stepping out of their house, taking a picture of the Milky Way. But not everybody does. Some people, are living in the city, or, areas with light pollution. And we need to, plan when we can go out, which things come into play that may be against us, for example, the moon and so on, or weather. So how do I plan to go out and take these pictures at night, right? So the first thing would be deciding on a location. Now, there are many locations all over the world, so I cannot decide a location for you, but I spent years planning and just playing around, sitting at home on different locations that I could take pictures of. And that's before even scouting or being there in person. And a lot of the pictures turned out to be exactly as I wanted. So, and if you're that far ahead prepared that you know already what you're going to do, then 99% of the time you're going to get the shot, or even something better than you had wished for. So what I like to use for planning is an application called Planet Pro. Now, it's literally this Planet Pro. You can find it on the App Store. It's a very cheap app, but it's an excellent app for planning. And what I'd like to do is I'll share my screen from my phone, and I'll give you an example of how I use the application for planning, to go out and shoot and so on, right? So I know somebody just wrote a comment about star trails, and we're not on that topic as to say, but I will answer the question. So yeah, basically, if your stars are a little bit out of focus, you will get thicker lines, more dreamy looking stars, and then you'll get also additionally a bit better color. So what we're going to do now is jump into the app, as I was calling it down here, Planet Pro. And I'm just going to show you how this goes for planning the night sky, right? So we have a menu up here, and we click that menu, and we go down to Epiphermous Features. And you have all these different kinds of modes that you can use for planning. Now I like to use, I'm under night photography, and I'm using the light pollution. And the good thing about that is now when I zoom out, it has the light pollution map laid in. So anywhere with red is higher on the Bortle scale, so leading to white, which is extremely bad. And black here, grey, is obviously great. Now here in Europe or in Switzerland, that doesn't really get much better than, a bit of blue down here. So, and on the Bortle scale, that would be something like Bortle 3. So what we want to do is plan a location. So I'm going to look for example, a place called the Reifelsee. It's a place in Zermatt. And I can add my location there. So we can click the spot, for example, here, and then we press plus. and we set the camera location, right? Now, I'll keep that for August for now. So you obviously want to put your time in down here. So you select your time, change your time and date, for example. We're just going to say 8th of August, for example. So 8th of August. And the great thing is, when you toggle these tools like this, we can see when the sun sets, when the blue hour begins, when the dark night starts, and so on. And we can also see when the moon rises. Now, a lot of people think that you need to wait for the new moon to go out and take pictures of the night sky, but that's not the case. What is the case is that you need to know when the moon is setting and when the moon is rising. And in the case on this date, for example, as the Milky Way, this little green line here that we can see, means this is kind of like the end of the night when the core of the Milky Way will be setting. And that's exactly when the moon rises. So that's kind of a perfect night that I can begin shooting, you know, at 10:51 and finish shooting just before the moon rises, right? Now, if we hit this square or rectangle down here and we press the viewfinder VR, and we just hit OK, what we'll get is, we'll get the mountain here, and we can see that when the dark night begins, this is how the Milky Way is, and as we move through time, we can see how the Milky Way moves, right? So then we'd know when it's probably game over for us already. So it might be way ahead of time. So by using this application, you know, you can know if you need to move. And let's say we move and step it up a notch. We move the location a bit up there. Maybe the terrain is a little bit higher and the Milky Way is a bit more visible, right? Like that. So this is a great app for planning and so on. Now you can plan all kinds of things in it. I'm going to show you one last thing, and that is stars and star trails. And the great thing about that is if you start it at the beginning of the night and now press the viewfinder, you can lock in your focal length. So let's say 14 millimeter, and we can go through the night and you can see how long you need to complete your lines, right? Now obviously I know most of you probably want to be pointing north towards Polaris and you want to get those circles, right? So, but it would give you an idea then of how long you need, right? So obviously if the night is not long enough, you might not be able to get them full trails that you're looking for. So that's why it's important to plan ahead of time. So if you cannot find the application and you need help finding it later, then just send me a DM. I'll be happy to share that application with you. But that is key for me for planning. Now we're going to just stop sharing the camera for a minute on that one, and just bear with me. Change it back to the comments. So I see someone asked about photopills. I don't use photopills because I find this application more superior for me, where it has the light pollution map laid in, it has the star trails function. I like that it can show me in VR mode the different terrain and so on, and that can really give me, I mean, as you see in the picture here, for example, this is the Matterhorn mountain, and this really gives me like a vision of how my image can really look, and that's important for me, you know, for planning ahead of time. So we talked, obviously we said aim to shoot on moonless nights or when the moon is not there, and then last key thing is check several weather apps. Now I use stuff like Windy, Clear Outside, Google Weather. I literally check about 5 different weather apps because not all of them are reliable. And if you check 4 or 5, and you know the percentage of them are favoring towards good weather, then you know you have good chances, right? Because the worst thing to do is to go out and then you get clouds blocking your, you know, the Milky Way or where you want to be shooting, right? Now, one thing I mentioned, since someone asked about star trails, now you can actually shoot star trails even during full moon nights. So the moon will not affect your images. Now, with that being said, the key is to not shoot with the moon in frame. So if the moon has already passed out of your frame, then you can begin shooting the star trail. Now, a little bit of that light may obviously affect the image, but the key is to underexpose in order to avoid such blown out images from the bright moonlight. So we're going to talk quickly just a few things about, the settings and so on. So, you can read that whilst I'm talking, but yeah, basically, for a single image, you want to go out, you want to take a picture of the Milky Way, and the kind of goal is to get the foreground bright enough exposed and also get the sky bright enough exposed. Now, as we can see, the foreground is always coming darker and the sky is always coming brighter. Now, if you overexpose your sky and it's too bright, you have the chance of burning out the core of the Milky Way, and you cannot recover that part of your image. So it's really kind of important to not overexpose your image and burn out. And the only thing you can really do is kind of bring up the shadows and darks in Lightroom or Photoshop, and you can do a little, noise reduction to counter any noise that's introduced when doing that. And I'll show you that later during editing and so on. So the great thing, I've written a small thing down here, and that's if you're using an ISO invariant camera. If you don't know what that term means, you can look it up online. But yeah, the Sony A7 IV, the camera I was talking about, that's basically most of the Sony cameras are ISO invariant, which basically means we can underexpose our images. They can be a bit darker, and I'll also show you an example later. And we can bring up the brightness during post-processing later on without damaging the image, and it wouldn't be any different than if I'd done it in camera. And the advantage of that is then you don't have to burn out any highlights, and you can mask during post-processing and bring up where you need it to be brighter. So I already jumped ahead. So anyway, so what are the key things, right? So I said camera stability. I told you, which cameras I recommend, or what I like to use, for example, mirrorless cameras, which kind of lenses I like to use. Now, let's say we have our equipment. We need to know now what settings we should put in our camera, right? So there are three things that matter. Obviously, that's ISO, exposure, and aperture. First thing is we're going to begin with exposure. Now, how do we determine how long our exposure can be when we take a picture, right? Well, we have something called the 300 rule. Some people will talk about the 500 rule, but I like to use the 300 rule. I find it to be more accurate. So you can let me know which one works better for you. I've always kind of believed the 300 works better for full frame, 500 works better for crop sensor, and so on. And all that this means is we take this number 300 and we divide it by our focal length that we are deciding to use. So for example, if I want to use a 14mm today, okay, I know that if I divide 300 by 14mm, I'll get around 21 seconds. And most cameras, are even numbers, so I tend to round that down to 20 seconds. That means that anything more than 20 seconds, I will start to get trails in my stars or unsharp stars due to the Earth's rotation. So in order to avoid that, we have to make sure to follow the 300 rule. Now, with that being said, there is some leeway, like you can push the boundaries a bit, so you can push it to 25 seconds. Now, you probably say, oh, will I not get trails? Now, if your focal lenses are narrow, if you're shooting with narrow lenses like 24, 35, 50, the 300 rule is really strict. But when you're shooting with 14 or 12mm and so on, you can push it a little bit and it's barely noticeable, the small trail. And sometimes I do that for time lapses and so on, because exposure is our friend. the longer the shutter is open and capturing light, the more you're getting. And this is much cleaner, obviously, than aperture and ISO, right? So once you've determined your exposure depending on your lens, the next is to decide which aperture I'm using, right? Now, obviously, if I have the fastest aperture, if I have a very fast aperture lens, the goal is to try and use all of that aperture, right? So on a lens like the Sony 14 f1.8, I'll be shooting at f1.8. If in a certain circumstance it's very bright and I really don't need that much, then I may stop it down. You'll find that if you stop down the lens a little bit, you'll have overall better sharpness on the edges. Some lenses tend to create coma or aberrations. That's kind of like these weird stretch stars on the corners of images. But when we're talking about taking single images and stuff and time lapses and anything that's not with advanced techniques, then I tend to recommend shooting with that aperture as fast as possible. Now, I know probably some people wonder, if there is a lens, if f2.8 is good enough or f1.4, or is it an f4 going to work? Now, of course, an f1.4 is great, f2.8 also great, but when we move to lenses that are like f4 or slower than that, they're not really that great for using, but you can get away with using them, but then you're going to be forced to kick up your ISO. I found that most of the f4 lenses and so on, or lenses slower than f4, tend to be not as optically, let's say, as good. Now, that's not with every lens, of course. I'm talking about, some of these kit lenses, the 24 to 105 and so on. They'll never be good as those prime lenses, which most of the prime lenses have faster aperture. But yeah, if you don't have, always those lenses, then you can, always increase the ISO. So we're going to talk about ISO, right? So, and we try to do a really quick, explanation on how to determine the ISO, right? Now, one thing you can do is you can Google your camera and you can check out what is my base ISO on my camera, or does my camera have a dual ISO? And I'm just going to explain this for my camera. So my A7 IV has a base ISO of 100 and its dual native second ISO is 400. So whether I shoot at 400 or 100, the noise is relatively the same. For me, that means more optimal to always be shooting in 400, right? So, and I even do that in brighter environments when I don't really need 400, but I just want a faster shutter speed. So now the thing is, with only 400 ISO, you're kind of limited there on how much in 20-25 seconds, even with a fast aperture, on sorry, on what you can capture, right? So, but I'm going to show you that it's not always the case, okay? And I'm going to show you the results that we get. So I've taken an image here that was 25 seconds long, and we can see that the stars are pin sharp, and this image on the right is actually how the image looked. So out of camera, right? So I used my second base ISO, which was 400, and it was f2.8 lens, 25 seconds. And I took this into Lightroom, and I just brought up the exposure, and I did a color balance. And we can see that there's not really that much noise. We're able to recover the shadows. We haven't burnt out any of the highlights. And we can now see what's actually going on, right? So this was my point about, if you Google and find out if your camera is ISO invariant, you can actually underexpose it quite a bit and still get good results. Now, you don't have to go to this extreme, okay? But obviously I've just done this for example. Now, the opposite of ISO invariant cameras are variant cameras, and I'm just going to show you an example of a variant camera versus an ISO invariant camera, for example, the Canon R. And those cameras tend to not work good when you try to increase the exposure in post-process. So normally what you'd have to do is use a higher ISO whilst out in the field. So you can see we get these green lines and some purple and some bad quality. Both same settings, same lens and so on. And if we jump forward now, what I've done is I've increased the ISO now to 6400. And you know, I didn't need to raise the exposure in Lightroom afterwards because they were bright enough. And you can see we get, you know, a similar result. Which one is better, you know, it's for you to decide. But obviously now the Canon R is performing much better. That's how it should perform, because it's a variant camera. It means it needs to have its exposure done in the field. Whereas an invariant camera like the Sony, that, you know, we have the option to underexpose, and we can do that later. But even in the case when we shoot with high ISO, as long as the highlights are not burnt out somewhere, we still get really good results. Now, and that would be, you know, why you don't have to shoot that dark. You can find a midpoint which suits you, for deciding on how much ISO you use. You know, one picture I'm using 400, and the other I'm using 6400. So that's for you to decide. You know, I can only recommend, you know, like 1600, 3200, numbers like those. But I tend to be flexible on my ISO. Just go out there, give it a go, see how it looks on my histogram. I'll explain the histogram later when we're in Lightroom and so on. And then you get a better idea of, you know, of kind of how that works, right? So my thing here, my presentation there is from another presentation, but I use it for talking about those beginner starting subjects. Now I'm just going to go back. You know, of course, I have other subjects that we can talk about, but they do take a lot of time, where there are more advanced techniques, which isn't covered in today's thing, because we're here to try and get those beginners and people that are new to this, you know, like, you know, give people a chance to go out and start taking these pictures, right? But if you're interested in more of that stuff, that's something you know, you can DM me, and we can talk about that later. So we're going to jump out of here because I already want to jump into Lightroom in a minute. I just want to check the comments. I see somebody's talking about how underexposed it is. So once we jump into Lightroom, there we can talk more about different pictures and so on, because I think it gives people a better idea of what's going on, right? So yeah. So we're going to be opening up Lightroom now. We're going to jump into Lightroom. Just quick reminder, today is sponsored by ViewSonic ColorPro. I'm here working on the VP2788 5K screen. And I just want to talk really quickly about it. I, for years, have been sitting on a MacBook Pro. You can't see it, but it's just here. And I've been working like that, since I started my career, just on a laptop. And I even set up the studio, and the whole time I'm on a laptop as well. And yeah, for years I was thinking like, oh, you know, I would like a screen, but what screen to get? And you know, it was so confusing online, and because I'm in the Mac and I'm in the Apple ecosystem, and you know, I just happened to start in that system, and I'm kind of like hooked in that system and don't really want to move over to Windows and so on. And you know, I look online, and most of the screens seem to be more situated for Windows users, and you know, and people that build PCs and so on. Yeah, and that's where I came across ViewSonic, and I saw that they have more, you know, of these viable options for the Mac ecosystem, and you know, of course, that sparked my interest. And yeah, I thought it was going to be also like complicated setting up, and it was literally from the moment it got here, it was very exciting, unpacking this, and it was literally, yeah, plug and play. You just open the box and direct plug and play, which is obviously a, you know, ease of use, and makes life easy and more exciting without without any hassle and so on. Another great thing about this is because I hate having so many like cables everywhere, or to find power sources. And the great thing is I have actually all under here, additional from the light that can turn on and off, which is great sometimes when I need a light. Is it has the Thunderbolt, four ports, so I can basically very easily charge my accessories here, like my keyboard, my mouse, my phone, stuff like that. And I mean, what more do you want other than that workflow going on? And yeah, since I've had it, it's just been incredible. So yeah, let's look now at my screen on Lightroom. We're going to look at some pictures. I'm going to show you stuff, how to edit. Remember, if you have questions, please drop them in the comments. I know that some people may have questions. I'm just going through the comments right now. So yeah, let's jump in, right? So we're here in Namibia right now, and I think we're at a place called, or not I think, we're at a place called Spitzkoppe. We can see, what's this image like? Obviously it's always nice to find an image. So here we have something that's more of a blue hour image. You can see the sky begins to get darker. So, but we may be able to even work, I want to work with one of the images closer to dark. No, it's not like that, for example. So this thing that you see up here on the right is the histogram, right? I was trying to talk about that earlier. Now, the histogram, you can see that in your camera, right? So when you take pictures and so on, if you go through the menu of the picture itself by clicking up and so on, you'll get a histogram, so you can see how your histogram is performing. Now, if I go into develop and I just increase that exposure, I want you to watch the histogram. See, so obviously the brighter your images, your histogram will be to the right, darker images will be to the left, right? Now, one key point when taking pictures is it's very important that the histogram is not spiking anywhere on the right, because the moment it spikes on the right, so, or actually the moment it touches on the right, what you're doing is you're burning out the highlights. So if in camera you burn out the highlights, they are unrecoverable when editing. Whereas the difference is when your image is a bit darker, you have the choice of how much you increase that exposure by, right? Now, obviously my image didn't need to be this dark. You can see I'm on a 24mm f1.4, 1600, so my ISO is fairly high. Now, I didn't need to shoot so short exposure, but the reason I've shot a short exposure is because I'm standing here and, people move, I'm not even that well sharp, and that's because I'm a person, right? I can't stand as still as the rock or the stars for a few seconds. So I tend to increase ISO and reduce exposure when people are in the subject, or even if I'm taking pictures of plants and there's some light breeze, wind or so on, or even extreme wind that could be moving subjects, right? So now that we're in Lightroom, what are the kind of tools that I use, to start working on an image? We're going to begin this at the start. So we just press reset. Now, the first thing I would do, obviously, is try to bring up the shadows. And we can see that's not doing much because my image is already quite underexposed. But what we can do is bring up the exposure slightly. Now, and obviously you want to decide, you know, do I want to see this kind of stuff down here, or do I want to kind of keep this subject here and this area more to the eye? So you see, if I kind of reduce the shadows a bit, and we keep the other stuff actually just a bit dark, and we focus more on this area here inside as the key subject with the sky above, I find it more interesting. Now this is personal preference, so I want to go down, and also, you know, if you find you have heavy vignetting, you can move the vignetting, and in some cases you might even want to increase the vignetting. I think right now we don't need to play with the vignetting. One thing I'll mention is that I always have under my lens corrections this disabled, not enabled, and I even have that all disabled in my camera as well. Now some people might tell you need to have that enabled. I don't need to prove anyone else wrong or so on, but I'm telling you, keep it disabled and don't use it ever. You may find use of it for daytime stuff or some kind of other photography, but when it comes to night photography, don't use it. The only thing I'm going to say is look at my pictures. If you like my pictures and you want to do similar pictures, then just follow my advice on not using these enabled. I leave them disabled. So what they do is, if I enable that, you'll see it will stretch out the corner, remove the vignetting and so on. And actually in the manual side, I can do this all myself. So I can decide if there needs to be that done. But I prefer to do that myself. It does not need to be decided by the computer. So learn to do those things manually. It's relatively easy. If you have like common aberrations, so if we zoom in on stars, this is what I was talking about. Some lenses tend to give these stretched stars on corners. Even you get color aberrations, it's the color there. You can use this tool here called defringe, and when I select that corner there, the purple, it will try to neutralize it, and I click this again and we can zoom out, and that will basically fix those stars and try to get rid of the halos. As you can see, we've introduced some other ones now, it seems. So let's take that one and click again. We normally try to get rid of the worst ones. So, and that should be fine. So now what we want to do is jump back on up. Obviously, color balance is self preference. Everybody decides themselves how they want their image. If they want it more warm, then obviously we increase the temperature. If they want it more cold, then we decrease. And we have the tint for going a bit more green or purple and so on. Today we can go for something that's a bit more neutral. We can always take the white balance selector, select a dark place, and you get a rough color balance like that, but it can look very neutral. What we can do now is increase the saturation slightly, get a little bit of color in that Milky Way. And now kind of is kind of your decision on how you really kind of want your sky to be. I think I will go a slight tad purple, maybe even a little bit of red. Now that I see red, I want to pull back a bit. Again, something like maybe something like that. So those are the basic steps. Now, if you're using solely Lightroom, and you're not using Photoshop, then you can, for example, take the mask tool, and we can select, for example, the sky. And once you create the sky mask, it's never that perfect, and you see it hasn't selected this part here. So what happens now, if I turn off the exposure, it's just selected this part. So I would have to press add, try and add in this to get a clean result. But then obviously you know, I could always change just the hue of the sky alone, for example, or fix the foreground or the self preference. And what I can also do is even create a sky mask, press invert, and now, for example, make my foreground brighter, you know, or increase the shadows, or change the white balance or so on. This is solely self preference. But I'm going to delete that mask. I'm not a fan of using it in Lightroom. What I'd like to show is how you take this into Photoshop and use this in Photoshop. I see somebody asked, is stacking necessary to get sharp results? So stacking does not get you sharper results. They can get you cleaner results. So you can reduce the noise and average them out. But that does not make your image sharper. So sharp is, your image must be taken sharp. So I have a rough, you know, edit, something like this. And we're going to continue to open this up in Photoshop. So we're just waiting for this to open up in Photoshop. Here we go. Another thing I will mention about this ViewSonic screen, and that is, if you're always using a laptop, your color accuracy is never 100%. So what I'm talking about is, for example, I edit images and then I export them as JPEGs and I post them on social media, or I even export them to have them printed, you know, like the picture behind, for example. And the color accuracy was never perfect. And now the difference that I have the screen and the color accuracy is, you know, is pro grade color accuracy. When I notice now, when I have side by side my MacBook and the screen, that there is a difference. And it's great because now I know that whatever I produce here on the big screen itself, regardless of how it looks on the Mac, I know that I'm going to get that quality now. When I export that image, it's going to look the same as I see it. Or when I print that image, it's going to look the same as the screen. So if you have those kind of issues where you export images or you try to print them, and you find that the color's not the same, or the brightness is less, or there are certain differences, it can be down to obviously your screen, what you're viewing on, what you're editing, and how you know how that gets exported later if the accuracy is not on point. So I just wanted to say that because I'm looking at them right now side by side, and it's crazy the difference that I get to see. So I'm here in Lightroom, and what I like to do, what I love about Lightroom is, I'm here in Photoshop. What I love about Photoshop is I have so many more tools. What we can do is duplicate the image by just going down and pressing plus. This way I can show you like a before and after. And I like to look around my image. I like to look to see if there are things I don't like. For example, these plane trails, I don't really like those. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a spot healing brush tool, and I'm going to minimize that size by right clicking. And what we can do is we can click up there, hold down shift, click, and remove that little trail. So whether it's satellite trails, plane trails, so on. So if you're taking multiple images of the same composition within this in a short time frame. So if I take this picture and I take it 10 more times, or 5 more times, and I stack those pictures, what happens is I can stack and average them out. I'll remove noise, so the noise here in the images, the grainy stuff, but I can also remove the difference between the images, which is the satellites and planes. So that's the great thing about stacking. So stacking is not going to make my images sharper, but they're going to make my images cleaner. But that doesn't mean you have to stack. I still get great images without stacking. Stacking is just an advantage to push it even a step further. So we go around, we remove the stuff we don't want. And then if we zoom out and we just do like a before and after, I know you probably can't see if I zoom in, maybe there. We've removed those small trails. And the same can be done for removing anything. So if you don't like this bush that's sitting here, you just try to remove the bush. Now you have to be careful how you use this tool, that you don't create artifacts and so on like that there. But if you're delicate with it, you should be okay. So we just remove a bit of it. It doesn't have to be perfect right now. So you see the more it begins to get a bit messy. It's not perfect. And we have like some hot pixels here. So the temperature was quite high, so we can remove those. Nobody's going to probably see them, but I see them, so I like to remove them. And there's one there. Obviously, if you print that picture and it comes out with a blue pixel, then obviously it might look kind of strange. If I zoom in, I notice the bush kind of bothers me here. So I'm just going to remove a bit of it so it's not taking your eye from the subject, if that makes sense. So for example, if we just click before and after, that bush kind of was in the way. So some small adjustments that will keep your image a little bit cleaner, right? Now, the reason I like to work with Photoshop is because I feel, I just want to read the comments quick. Is the Lightroom app on iPad as good as Lightroom Classic on computer? Well, the computer is always better than an iPad, in my opinion. So it goes with saying, you know, phone, iPad, the best is always to be on a desktop or a laptop. For, you know, and I did not really notice the difference, for example, with, if we look in the Adobe thing, you know, we have like Lightroom Web and Classic and so on. Any kind of Lightroom version works pretty much the same, but it should be used on a desktop. So we made those first adjustments, and the next thing what I want to do is I want to create a copy of my image, like that. And I know that most of you probably won't have this. It's kind of like just an optional tool, and I have this down as from RC Astro, and it's called Star Exterminator. And what it allows me to do is to remove my stars. So I think it's about $50 US. It's not mandatory. And if you don't have that, then you still do what I will do after this. But this just gives me like a tiny advantage on editing. So the reason that I get an advantage of editing when I remove the stars is, if I can remove the stars, I can see what are below the stars, and I can work on editing that detail below the stars. The other advantage is I won't burn out my stars, you know, like stretch them and make them too big. And you'll see as it's done, you'll see the difference that when we look here now and we look before, the contrast is so much different in what is below them stars, right? Like there's so much detail sitting there below that you just don't really see. So I don't use any kind of presets. I mean, this is not a preset, for example. The RC Astro is more of an action with a formula that does this. And somebody asked if I edit in other, but I do edit in PixInsight, but we're not going to be doing that today because it's way more advanced than some of this basic stuff. So yeah, I've removed the stars, and for anyone that does have the RC Astro, they're going to wonder, how do I put back the stars? So I make a copy of that layer, and I can toggle that one off, and now I have below the original image. We can turn it off, we don't need that. Then I have original image minus the stuff we didn't like, and then I have this image where I've removed the stars. Now this image where I've removed the stars, I'm going to change its blend mode to subtract. And what that's going to do is going to show me the difference between the images, and it shows me that the stars have been subtracted. The stars have been subtracted from that. And now when I highlight these layers and merge them together, I now have just a layer of stars alone. And the image now, we have the original one, then we have the image with no stars, and we have above the image of stars alone. And when we change that to one of these modes like light and screen, color dodge, now we have stars. And the great thing is, this would be something closer to how it looked. And if I change it to like color dodge, we do like a kind of star reduction. So the stars are a bit smaller than before, and we can see a bit more of that detail behind, right? So, but right now what we want to do is turn off the stars, because we want to edit this sky a bit and get a few more details. So what we can do is take the quick selection tool, make sure you're on highlight all and not just plus or minus, and we can select the sky. It did not work because I'm on the wrong layer. So let's select the layer below, press deselect, and let's try again. There we go, select that, and we need to press plus, and we need to plus the sky in there. So let's try to plus there, and if we zoom in, we need to minus a bit here. That's minus. So it's not perfect, you can see there's a bit missing there. It's obviously highlighting me as well. But it's not an issue. And what we can do is, whenever we've made a selection and we select any of the adjustments like curves will create a mask on that selection. So now when I bring up, if I stretch, for example, so I like to draw S curves. So I increase the highlights a bit and decrease the darks a bit, something like that, for example, right? Like that. And what we can do is we can select the mask and just feather out. And if you feather out, we need to zoom in. So if we remove the feather, and we toggle that on off, you can see there's a difference, right? The mask was not clear. If we feather it out a bit, it will just kind of blur edges, and it won't be so visible. So you need to double check. That's fine. And what you can do is you can do that again, or you can duplicate. Obviously duplicate might be too much. So what I'll do, select the curves, reset just the curve thing, so I can just stretch a very tiny amount and not be too intense. And as you stretch, you start to increase color. You might get color that is unwanted. So what I can do is take a color balance tool, select that to apply to just the layer below, which means here, and we can change that, for example, to be like a bit more cyan in the midtones, maybe a bit more green, maybe like that. We can say for the highlights, I want to be like a bit more red, maybe take a bit more green. So for example, something like that. And if we toggle that on and off, see, we get rid of a bit of that purple. We didn't need that purple in our image, right? Now, you can do that however you want. You can also apply that to the foreground alone, for example, color balance and so on. I really, these rocks are already kind of red and warm, and we have this yellow light going on. So this is kind of the style I'm going with today. I'm going with this red, warm feeling. The next thing what I would want to apply to this is probably a bit of contrast. So we look for the contrast, which is there. And I'm just going to select a bit of contrast, a very tiny bit. I need to be careful. Something like that. And next I'm going to press Shift, Option, Command E. Shift, Option, Command E. Basically stamps all my layers below into one layer like that. And I want to change the blend mode on this to soft light. And I'm going to press Filter, Other, High Pass. I'm going to increase that number to around 200. Just press OK. So, and what that did that. It's basically like a kind of way of increasing details, right? Now, I want to create a mask on that. So by selecting the mask, and I want to press Invert or Command I, and it's toggled off right now. So it's not toggled off because it's inverted, you can't see it. And now when we take a brush, and whenever you've got a mask, black and white, so white is reveal and black is hide, right? So if I brush here, I can brush, for example, just where I want some details, for example. So I don't want details here, for example. There's not really anything going on. So I just want to get some of these dark dust lanes in the Milky Way more visible. And again, with all kinds of masks, I like to feather out so I don't have any hard contrast visible. Now if we toggle the stars back on and we just see with that clarity layer, it's not clarity, it's called high pass. It gives it just a bit more of a kick. Now it's self-preference. I can see that I don't like it down here, so I can just invert and brush that part out. So, but we have something that looks like that, right? So, and what I want to do is Shift, Option, Command E. Just want to stamp one layer on top. I can toggle that off for the moment. Just want to go into the chat. So was that clear till now? Did anyone have any questions about how I got to that moment? Sure, I will show once more how to do the high pass tool. We'll do another image. So, and then if we minimize everything and we just go back to our original image. So that was the original, and then with some light editing here we can get to that, for example. So I may make some more final adjustments, but you know, relatively somewhere along the lines of that, right? So all in all, not a bad result. We can save that for now. Now we can jump back to Lightroom. The chat is open. As I said, any questions, please do let me know. So you will be able to view this later on. So let's just go back a second. So I know some people are asking if the same results are possible with Lightroom alone solely. So we were here before with Lightroom alone solely. So we were here before. So this is where we were before in Lightroom, where we got to. Then we took it into Photoshop and we created this. And the question somebody asked is, can we get the same results in Lightroom? Now, if we're in Lightroom, what is it we can do in Lightroom solely? So when we want to remove artifacts and so on, we have tools here like this one, remove, I can click, prefer to, okay, let's just press delete. Let's try to draw a line. It likes to duplicate from the place closer to it, for example. So it did a terrible job then. So I'm not an expert on using that tool. Let me see which options there are. Stamp, clone. So that's why I used to prefer to use Photoshop. I'm not really a fan of that, but okay, it kind of works. It might be a bit harder removing some of the stuff down here, for example. As I said, you won't be able to remove the stars and use that RC Astro tool that I was talking about. You will be able to mask the sky. The mask will not be perfect in Lightroom. You will have to add parts of the sky if it works. Okay, select objects. I don't think this is going to work, but we can try. It kind of worked. But what I don't like is, you know, Lightroom tends to select the whole subject, right? And you still have curves down here, so you can kind of, in a sense, replicate it. At the same time, I want to fix that color balance just like we did in Photoshop. but you don't, the more you develop in your experience within Lightroom, I know there are people that can work really good with Lightroom. So, for example, down with the color mixer and so on, or color grade and so on. But I'm personally just not a fan of using those kind of tools to control and manipulate my sky. And I just love the flexibility in Photoshop of how you can create masks just so easily. Lightroom is really kind of a basic thing, and not like full hands on deck for those kind of things. Lightroom is made really for kind of basic editing. And as I said, I know people can push the limits here, but I tend to not push them myself. So I created one mask that allowed me to do those tones. And obviously then I could select the sky again and select the second one and be sure to add and select object and do like we did before. It's not selected it as I wanted. Okay. And again, we can do another curve. Be careful not to go too intense. And this time I'll add the contrast on top, and I'll be sure to fix color balance slightly. So we can just hit enter. So, and if we look at the difference, with that star, like the star reduction option in Photoshop, it really makes quite a difference. But other than that, there's not much difference. It's the stars that are really making the difference, and we are stretching the stars the more that we do editing on top of them, and that's why I like to remove them in Photoshop. You see, like, I know that the stars are smaller because of the reduction, but they've not been increased. Whereas here, if we go back to the beginning and now, you see that the stars are bigger themselves. We've only increased them by editing on top of them. So that's why it's really kind of important to, like, if you have the option to remove the stars, then you can edit the stuff below, right? Now, if we're solely using Lightroom, another good thing which I didn't mention is noise reduction. So if we jump down into the noise reduction tab, so nowadays you have really great the denoise, the AI. I use a lot of the time stuff like this for really noisy images, and we can see the result that we will get. So I believe there's some lag in the loading. So if everybody can hear me in real time, so that seems to be working. We have the delay of the screen right now, which I'm sorry for. Then yeah, I'll be happy to answer some questions, some Q&A that we can talk about. At least we managed to get through one process, of editing an image in Lightroom and Photoshop. I believe until now the screen was working correctly, and it doesn't seem to be showing me why it's not working, because in all systems for the streaming platform it should be working. What we can talk about for the minute, I don't know if you can see, man. Have you seen the screen, how it looks? I'm just trying to turn my webcam for a minute. Just like give you a quick view. It's such a minimalist design, the screen. And it looks so good with the setup here in the office. So just looking at the comments, obviously people, please drop some comments. Yes, so Andy, yeah, I do use averaging and noise reduction when I stack my images. I like to use software like Starry Landscape Stacker. You can also stack manually in Photoshop by opening all your layers on top of each other and converting them to a smart object, and then stack that smart object into a median, for example. So yeah, I've been taking photos for just under, I believe, 8 years. And yeah, I learned edit through practicing. You just have to, trial and error and keep trying it out. And eventually you get there. So I don't know, the screen is still paused showing from before. I have one other idea how to get this to work. That's to remove. So excuse me everyone, but I've figured our method. So it should be working now. So the issue was I had to restart via OBS. So we can open up Lightroom again. So we still have some time, so what we can do is we can look, for example, at one more image and edit that. And then I love the questions about editing. I know some people keep asking about star trails and so on. We won't be really talking about that technique today, but I can give you a few pointers on how to get good star trails. I do like to unfocus my stars. Then I get, the fainter stars become non-visible, and it creates thicker lines and more separated lines. And obviously when you're in bokeh or out of focus, you tend to get a bit more color. Another key is underexposing, so that we don't burn out those highlights of stars, right? And then I like to use star stacks for stacking my star trails. I literally just throw a camera on a time lapse, throw a camera on a tripod, set up a time lapse, decide which direction I want to take my star trails, and I just let that run until the battery is kind of dead. So obviously I want a fully charged battery, fresh free memory card, and then those images that I get, I will turn them into a star trail. So as I was trying to say, is the difference between Photoshop and Lightroom is, I'll let you judge the difference, but I'm always gonna prefer to use Photoshop for that reason there, right? So what we can do is we can look for another kind of image. What I'm going to do is, I'm not going to look at foreground, so I'm going to look at more Milky Way, because I know that most people are here solely because they're interested in the Milky Way. And what we want to do is we're going to look at just a single image of the Milky Way. So one of these is the sky. So there are some clouds passing through in these images. I'm not sure if you can see. I want one relatively less cloud, something like that. Okay, we're going to look at the histogram. We can see that it's ISO 400. And we can see it's on a 14mm, it's f2.2, and it's 120 seconds. Now, how is it my stars are sharp at 120 seconds? And this is my 14mm, the f1.8 lens. Why did I shoot at f2.2? And why did I shoot so long? And the reason is because I was using a sky tracker. And now a sky tracker is basically a device that allows you to counter the Earth's rotation and bypass the rule, or the 300 rule, and take longer exposures. And in doing so, I can shoot with a much less ISO. I can shoot with a slower aperture, like I've done here, f2.2. And I can gather more time, right? So I can gather more light, more information. And now I will just show you how to edit such a picture, and then you can be the judge of, of seeing how much more, information is there when the ISO is lower, when the aperture is maybe a bit better, and when the exposure is longer, right? And then that can be something for you to decide that, how is it I, take my images to the next step? What is it I need to do? And I will always tell everybody, the first step, once you're out and shooting, the first upgrade to really go for is a sky tracker, because even if you have lenses that are like f4 and stuff, it doesn't matter anymore that they're f4, because when we throw them on a tracker, we can shoot for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so we can gather enough light so we can still get something of good quality. As opposed to earlier, I said if you have an f4 lens, you're going to have to really push the ISO high, all right? So now, the point is, the tracker being the first upgrade that you get kind of means that even the lenses that were not, not so good, you kind of upgraded them too now. And if you had a really bad lens that performed poorly at f1.4 or when the aperture is wide open, now when you slow them down at f2.8 or whatever it is, you'll get a better lens, if that makes sense. So, I'll just do an example. Like I had a Sigma R, it's a 20mm f1.4, and at f1.4, that's great for single images, but it performed terrible. The edges were horrible and it was obvious. But when I put that lens on a tracker, I could slow it down to f2.8 and shoot for a couple of minutes, and then I got really good results. So, you as I said, in single images, you're limited. You need to use that aperture. But with the tracker, it unlocks a lot of things for you. Not just the time, but it unlocks the potential in your lenses that are not so good. So yeah, what can we do with this image? So, I'm not going to stack today. That's way too advanced, but I'm just going to give you a taster of a tracked image, an image that's longer than what we can normally take. And we'll do this first one in Lightroom. We just begin selecting the neutral part of the image. We can increase the exposure. We can see that the histogram is dark. And come on, obviously we don't want to burn out the core of the Milky Way. We can always reduce the highlights a bit. So I'm going to save a certain amount. We can pump up the saturation a bit. So we have a bit of clouds in there, but it's not too much of an issue, right? So we can even throw in a bit of contrast. We can even do little curves here. Just check all of my off. So just a very quick edit in Lightroom. So we can see my highlights are way too bright. So that'll be, let's bring down the exposure just a tad. We have some strong vignetting, so we can remove the vignetting down here. So for example, in Lightroom, so I've done a small tone curve here. I've made some basic adjustments here. I'm not going to create any kind of masks and so on. I know somebody in the comments mentioned I could do a luminance range mask, clicking on the bright part of the stars. I've actually never done that kind of thing. Let's see if we can do a mask. So we're not people range, luminance range. Let's see if we can figure this out. I'm not sure that's going to work for me like that. So unfortunately I have to delete that. Hit enter. So whatever, we have relatively decent results. What I was trying to show you before earlier was about noise reduction. Now, I just remembered, and I wanted to show you on this image here. And I was trying, here we go. So I used the AI denoise. And in some circumstances, it does great things. But I feel like it just removes too much. Now, if your image is crazy noisy, then that denoise AI thing is great. But other than that, it's quite easy to just use the luminance and decide for yourself how much you want to do. You can also, like kind of create a masking and press option. you hold down Option, and then when if you do this like that, you have to see it by your eyes. If you hold down Option, you can kind of see in it. You say which way you want to kind of remove the noise from. So you have a bit more. But honestly, those kind of noise reduction is quite decent. I've never had to use any external noise reduction for my images, so I mean, if it works for me using basic stuff like Lightroom, I tend to do mine in Camera Raw and Photoshop before I finish. I didn't do it on this image. It's not too noisy and it's not bothering me so much, so it's not always needed. So we want to jump back. So we edited this picture and I was just kind of showing like, okay, what can I do in Lightroom? But I want to again open this up in Photoshop and I'll move a little bit faster. I'll show that high pass tool again that somebody was asking about earlier, so they know how to use that again. But there's really kind of a big difference in the results you can get. Now, what I really like about this image is the color balance, but I'm going to remove stuff like contrast, and I'm going to remove this as well. We're going to reset that. Reset channels. I'll keep it like that. Oops. Ignore me. We got reset channels. And now we're just going to edit this and open this in Photoshop. So try to bear with me. I'm going to use the same technique that I used before. It means that I'm going to move a little bit fast, not to waste so much time, but I'm basically going to duplicate the image like I did before. Now press filter. I have my RC Astro Star Exterminator tool because I like to remove my stars. So somebody did ask about what's the best trick to get more signal for the color. Modified camera obviously is gonna really help get you these reds and so on. I'd say that's probably key number one. Number two is tracking, long exposures. Number three is obviously dark skies. The darker the skies, the more colors you get. So now we can see with the stars removed. I definitely don't want to be brushing there. Let's press Command T. We can see that we can even see how many clouds there are on this kind of shot, right? But it's okay, it's not an issue. We're going to duplicate that star layer below and toggle the one off on top, and again I need to change the blend mode to subtract, highlight them too. Before I highlight them too, I'm going to do a duplicate. Now highlight them too, merge layers. I have my star layer from top, which I can press, change its blend mode. So right now we want to work I want to work on this image, and I'm going to do, I pretty much do the same kind of techniques all the time. So I love to work with curves, so just increasing the highlights, decreasing the shadows and so on, and then the Milky Way really begins to pop, right? So we're going to go again, I'll be really careful for the core of the Milky Way. You know, I want some kind of contrast in the image. In the case that I burn out those highlights, what I can do is just take a mask, make sure I'm on a black brush, and just brush out the area where I think I blew it out. And on any kind of mask, always feather, right? Because if you don't feather, you have these lines. So we feather until it's non-visible. And then now I still have this curves, but I haven't burnt out the Milky Way, right? So now where it sounds like this, again the image begins to get a bit red. As you stretch, some kind of color tends to dominate, and it's our job to kind of bring that back. And in order to get separation of the colors and so on, obviously, you know, if everything's red, then the reds will be blown, washed out. If it's too blue, again. So you're kind of looking for a relatively neutral point, you know, but at the same time, it's preference of yourself, of the colors you like, right? So there's the midtones. I'll look at the highlights. The highlights want to go a little bit more red. Maybe I'll push in some green that will help the background as bright patches. And definitely don't need to go too much, yeah, something like that. Now we work with the shadows. Hopefully we'll pick up the shadows there. And I kind of maybe want to push it a bit more blue actually. So this whole color balance is something like that. So now if we zoom out, we have more separation in our image, right? So now we're going to move to the step of pressing Shift, Option, Command E, stamping everything together. We can minimize this stuff below, and then we can see we came from this to this, right? Now is the point. Somebody was asking how to use high pass. Apparently I went a bit too fast, so we're going to try to do that slower because I know it might be beneficial for people. Now, one thing I like to say is I don't focus stack my images, and if you're ever wondering how I get the foreground as well sharper, I use what's it called, high pass. So somebody in the comments says, what is the best way to balance Astro and modified shots? Well, if you noticed, I'm working with Astro modified shots, so that's kind of how you do it. So if you saw before on Lightroom, we began with an image that came out relatively purple. So depending on your white balance in camera will depend, you know, how your image looks, right? So, but if you find your images are too red in camera, then maybe you want to make your images a bit colder, and then when they're colder they tend to look like this, right? Because let me just reset the picture. If or maybe not reset that picture, but another one. If in camera my picture, so it just needs a minute to load. If in camera, you know, if I take a picture and my camera looks, if I take a picture on my camera and my camera is Astro modified and it looks like this is because your white balance is too warm in camera. So, but if it's colder, then it's going to look like that, right? And if it's midpoint, it's going to be somewhere like that, right? So mine was looking something like that. So in the end, if it comes out of camera and I take that dropper and pick it, I get there. Or if my camera originally, you know, if the picture was originally like that from camera and I select in Lightroom, I get the same result. So it really doesn't matter what you see in camera, but if you prefer to see it colder in camera, then shoot a colder temperature. If you prefer to see it warmer, like more red, then shoot a higher number on the Kelvin value. So just don't use auto white balance in camera. So I actually use many trackers. I don't have them all here. I use Ioptron, SkyGuider Pro. I use Ioptron HST. I use the Nomad Move Shoot Move. I even have a Skywatcher somewhere here. I have quite a few trackers. All have their different purposes. Sometimes better than others and so on. But yeah, the Move Shoot Move is a great lightweight tracker that you can use. But if you want to use heavier loads, you want to do more hardcore stuff, or getting some really good data, then obviously maybe something bigger like from Ioptron might be more suitable for you. If you have questions about that, feel free to DM me later, and I would be happy to answer that. So I hope I answered that question about white balance, because it's really kind of basic. You can just take the dropper, or you can manually decide how you do it. But either way, we got to where we are right now, and we got to this result to begin with. Now, somebody was asking about high pass. Sorry that I didn't do it before. Let's do that step again. So to do that step, I'm going to duplicate the image, and the image above, I'm going to change its blend mode to soft light. Now, once that layer is soft light, I go up to filter, and I press other, and I press high pass. And the value in pixels on high pass should be about 200. And I press OK. So now that layer that I just created, the duplicated one, that I changed its blend mode to soft light and then pressed filter high pass, it's created a layer that looks like that. Now what I can do is create a mask, and on that mask press invert so it's turned off. And now with a brush in black and white, I can brush in white where I want my detail, right? And this high pass will also increase colors a bit, so sometimes that can be useful, other times not. So, and then we can again feather that, and then put the stars on top, and then toggle that on off. And then you get like a result like that, no? So if we press File, Save, and we go back to the Lightroom, and then we can kind of compare. So we had this image in Lightroom and then in Photoshop. So, and we haven't done any stacking. We haven't used any filters. So again, it's just one single image versus another, one in Lightroom, one in Photoshop, and there you can see the difference in what is achievable and so on. So what I want to show you quick is, for example, is here, for example, when you might want to see foreground, because we didn't really discuss it earlier, is, I just thought about it now, so I just want to show it quick, is we can increase the shadows and that for certain circumstances. And again, to answer the question of the guy saying, my Astro modified camera is coming out red. Again, when we select you know, the dropper tool there, we're going to get a relatively neutralized image, right? So there's not much difference between, you know, the darker image that I showed you earlier, where I was going for a darker foreground. And when we want to just increase foreground, you know, we can increase that part alone. You can do a noise reduction there. And then we have sky itself. You can always edit such images separately and then combine them in Photoshop, again by creating masks where you mask out the sky and reintroduce another sky into that image, or you can use the sky replacement tool. So are there any other questions? It's quite quiet right now. So I'll let you be the judge of whether Lightroom or Photoshop was better on that. But I think it's pretty obvious, you know, the power of Photoshop is far superior. And I mean, there are even other softwares when you take this more advanced, you can move to stuff like PixInsight or APP, Astro Pixel Processor, and so on. So yeah, if there are any questions, we do like a Q&A for a few minutes, and then soon we'll be bringing the session to an end. So until I get questions, again, yeah, you know, again, a big thanks to ViewSonic and ColorPro for sorting this out. They wanted us to get together and, you know, show what is capable, you know, how to edit your pictures and so on. And as I said, the screen that I'm using has changed a lot for me in how I, you know, create my images for exporting those images. I look at them on one screen and I see them completely different. So what I mean by that is, for example, the ViewSonic, I have this true ColorPro accuracy, right? And it's not just about the color, it's also about kind of the contrast and stuff. So when I look at my ViewSonic ColorPro screen, the image has like a kind of minimalist look. And then when I look over to the MacBook screen, it's like far more contrasty and punchy. And of course that may sound like a benefit. The problem is when I export that image, you know, it looks like the ColorPro. Well, that's not the problem. That's the good thing, because then the ColorPro is accurate. But the MacBook is not giving me the image I see on the MacBook. And then I know where I need to push my image even more, or where I need to make sure I get the color that I want before exporting. And that's been a huge advantage for me in bettering my images, you know. So let me just check the comments and see what's going on with everyone. So yeah, I did say you could use high pass for the foregrounds. It's one way to sharpen up out of focus foregrounds and so on. So I shoot my images on a modified camera for foreground as well. No difference for me. If you're trying to do southern trail, so point into the southern cross and get like kind of circles in the southern hemisphere, then basically you can just use a compass and put it on the back of your camera and point south, and then you'll get them trails like you want. So yeah, I've tried to answer all the comments that came through. I want to thank you, everybody that attended today. I hope that this class was helpful. And if you'd like to learn more and know more, feel free to DM me on Instagram. I'll be happy to help. I do have an online master course that you can join, where we edit pictures. You know, every 2 weeks we have these live sessions and so on. But yeah, hopefully this was useful to you. Thanks again for watching. Feel free to subscribe to my channel and give a thumbs up. So yeah, take care everyone, and clear skies.